My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm in my early 30s now, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of person people describe with words like quiet, reliable, easy to overlook. I work in a field that doesn't beg for attention, and I've learned how to carry myself without asking to be seen. If you met me casually, you might assume I've lived an unremarkable life. That assumption wouldn't be cruel, it would just be incomplete. For years, even inside my own family, I was treated as background noise. Not the kind of neglect that leaves bruises or dramatic stories, just a steady absence of curiosity. I was the child who didn't need checking on, the one whose opinions didn't alter dinner conversations, the one who was quietly labeled a waste of space because I didn't perform successfully loudly enough. No one said it every day, they didn't have to. It was implied in the way plans were made without me, in how my achievements were met with silence, and in how my failures were remembered longer than my efforts. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about shouting matches or exposing secrets at a family table. It's about something slower and, in many ways, harder to see. It's about what happens when a dismissed child grows into an adult who stops asking for permission to exist. When silence stops being something forced on you and becomes something you choose. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through a long stretch of my life. The invisible years, the small moments that taught me my place, and the internal shift that changed everything without anyone noticing at first. You'll hear about the role I was assigned, the patience I learned, and the kind of preparation that doesn't look like ambition until it's already done. There is a dinner near the end of this story, yes, and there is a moment when the life I built quietly can no longer be ignored. But that moment isn't the point. It's only the mirror. I'm telling this the way it actually felt. Restrained, sometimes lonely, often confusing, but grounded in honesty. No dramatization, no villains, just people behaving according to who they were, and one person deciding to become someone else without asking for approval. If you've ever been underestimated not because you lacked ability, but because you lacked noise, you may recognize parts of yourself in this journey. And as you listen, I want to ask you one gentle question. Have you ever wondered who you might become if you stopped trying to prove your worth to people who were never really looking? For most of my childhood and well into adulthood, I wasn't seen as a problem, and I wasn't seen as a promise either. I existed somewhere in between, useful, quiet, and largely forgettable. In my family, that middle space was the most dangerous place to be, because nothing you did there ever required reflection from anyone else. My parents liked clear stories. My older brother was the ambitious one, the risk taker, the loud achiever whose mistakes were reframed as learning experiences. My younger sister was the fragile one, the dreamer, emotional, protected. I didn't fit either narrative. I did well enough in school, never caused trouble, never demanded resources. From the outside, that looked like success. Inside the house, it translated into irrelevance. When relatives asked about me, the answers were short. She's fine. She's working. She's always been independent. Independent was the word they used most. It sounded like praise, but it functioned like a dismissal. Independence meant no follow-up questions, no concern, no investment. It meant I didn't need encouragement or help or acknowledgement. I had learned early that needing nothing was safer than needing something and being ignored. At dinner, conversations moved around me as if I were furniture, not intentionally cruel, just practiced. Plans were discussed assuming I'd adapt. Decisions were made assuming I'd understand. If I disagreed, it was framed as an inconvenience, not an opinion. So I stopped disagreeing, not out of fear, but out of efficiency. Resistance required energy, and energy felt wasted where nothing changed. What hurt wasn't that they didn't celebrate me. It was that they didn't register me. My presence didn't alter the room. My absence didn't create a gap. When I got my first job offer after college, my mother nodded and asked if it came with health insurance. When I mentioned a promotion years later, my father reminded me not to get ahead of myself. Their words weren't harsh. They were small, flat, final. Over time, those reactions shape you. You start to calibrate yourself downward. You choose a language that doesn't invite scrutiny. You present achievements as accidents. You learn that enthusiasm is embarrassing if no one mirrors it back. So you develop a neutral tone. You become good at saying things like, "It's nothing," and meaning it. Inside the family system, I was assigned the role of the reliable extra, the one who would show up early, clean up without being asked, and handle logistics quietly. The one whose emotional needs were so low maintenance, they eventually stopped being considered needs at all. If something went wrong, I was expected to absorb it. If something went right, it belonged to everyone. And somewhere along the way, a sentence began to form. Not spoken directly to me, but around me, a kind of shared assumption that I wasn't going anywhere remarkable, that I lacked ambition, that I would probably stay exactly where I was, because people like me always did. I heard it in jokes made when they thought I wasn't listening. She's not really a risk taker. She's practical, not driven. At least she's stable. Stable became another soft dismissal. Stability, in their eyes, was what you settled for when you couldn't win. And because I didn't argue, because I didn't correct them, because I didn't perform hunger or outrage, their perception calcified into certainty. What they never understood was that silence doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes it means observation. Sometimes it means someone is learning the shape of the room, the patterns of power, the cost of speaking too soon. I wasn't shrinking, I was mapping. But at that time, I didn't have language for it yet. All I knew was that within my own family, I occupied a narrow space where effort didn't convert into value, where being good wasn't enough to be seen, where love wasn't withdrawn but never fully offered either. That was who I was to them. Not a disappointment, not a success, just background. And for a long time, I believed that role was permanent. The first moment, I remember clearly, wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no slammed doors. That's why it stayed with me, because nothing about it seemed important enough for anyone else to notice. And yet it changed the way I listened to everything that came after. I was 24. I had been working full-time for a little over a year, living on my own, paying my bills without help. That alone felt like something worth acknowledging, at least to myself. I came home for a Sunday dinner, the kind we had a few times a year when schedules aligned. The house smelled the same as always. Roasted vegetables, something simmering, familiarity layered so thick it felt permanent. At some point during the meal, my father asked my brother about his latest plan. He was considering leaving his job to try something bigger. Everyone leaned in, questions were asked, concerns were voiced, then softened. My mother said, "You've always had potential. You'll figure it out." Then my sister talked about a course she wanted to take. Not a concrete plan, just an idea. The table shifted again. Encouragement flowed easily. My mother offered to help with the cost. My father suggested contacts. I didn't interrupt. I waited, the way I always did, for a natural opening. When it came, I mentioned briefly that my manager had asked me to take on additional responsibilities. It wasn't a boast, it was a fact. I framed it carefully, neutrally. I said it might lead somewhere long-term. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one, just a pause. My father nodded once and said, "That's good, someone has to keep things running." Then he turned back to my brother. That was it. No follow-up, no curiosity, no question about what the responsibilities were or what they meant for me. The conversation moved on so smoothly that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it entirely. Everyone else did. I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, and felt something precise settle in. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. It was the first time I realized that my efforts would always be interpreted as maintenance, not momentum. That is when I grew. It would be seen as staying in place. Later, when I helped clear the table, my mother thanked me automatically. The way you thank someone for passing the salt. Useful, expected, replaceable. That night, driving back to my apartment, I replayed the moment over and over, not because it hurt, but because it taught me something. It showed me the exact line where interest stopped, where imagination failed, where they could no longer see past the version of me they'd already decided on. The cut wasn't the dismissal itself, it was the confirmation. After that, I started noticing smaller things. How my suggestions were acknowledged only when repeated by someone else. How my opinions were treated as logistical input, never vision. My exhaustion was invisible because I handled it quietly. Once, months later, my mother joked to a relative on the phone, "Evelyn's always been low maintenance. We never had to worry about her." She laughed. The relative laughed. I stood in the hallway and understood that low maintenance didn't mean easy to love. It meant it was easy to overlook. I didn't confront them, not because I was afraid, but because I sensed it wouldn't land. Confrontation requires a shared reality, and we didn't have one. In their version, nothing had happened. In mine, something had shifted permanently. That was the first small cut, clean, precise, almost surgical. It didn't bleed, didn't scar immediately, but it changed the way I moved. I stopped offering unrequested context. I stopped translating my inner life into a language they didn't value. I began to separate what I shared from what I built. They thought nothing had changed. They were right in one way. Everything important was changing somewhere they weren't looking. Once you recognize a pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. At first, that awareness feels sharp, almost painful. But over time, it dulls. It becomes background noise. Something you learn to live with, something you stop expecting to change. After that dinner, nothing in my family dynamic shifted on the surface. Holidays still happened. Phone calls still came, infrequently but predictably. Birthdays were acknowledged with brief messages and practical gifts. The absence of curiosity wasn't framed as neglect. It was framed as trust. They trusted that I was fine. They trusted I didn't need much. They trusted I would continue to be exactly who I'd always been. And for a while, I accepted that framing. I told myself they weren't trying to hurt me. I told myself this was just how families worked. Some people were loud, some were quiet, and the quiet ones didn't get the spotlight. I told myself that wanting more acknowledgement was immature, that adulthood meant self-validation. Those explanations were convenient. They allowed me to stay calm. They allowed me to remain agreeable. They allowed everyone else to remain comfortable. Every visit reinforced the same message. When I talked about work, responses were brief and utilitarian. When I mentioned feeling tired, it was met with practical advice instead of concern. When I expressed uncertainty, it was reframed as a lack of ambition. "You've always been cautious," my father would say, as if caution were a flaw rather than a choice. At first, I corrected them gently. I tried to explain that what looked like caution was actually planning. That which sounded like contentment was focus. Those explanations went nowhere. They weren't challenged, but they weren't absorbed either. The words floated for a moment, then disappeared. Eventually, I stopped explaining. Silence became a habit, not a sulk, not withdrawal, just a selective absence. I answered questions. I showed up when expected. I did what was required, and I kept the rest to myself. The strange thing about being dismissed consistently is that it teaches you efficiency. You learn which conversations cost energy and which ones are pointless. You learn how to read the room before you speak. You learn that sharing too much with people who have already decided who you are only gives them more material to misinterpret. So I began to curate. I talked about neutral topics. I gave updates that couldn't be minimized because they were intentionally vague. I let them assume I was static. And in doing so, I unknowingly gave them exactly what they expected. There was a moment, maybe a year later, when my sister accused me of being distant. She said it casually, half joking, during a family call. "You never tell us anything anymore," she said. I smiled and said, "There's not much to tell." She accepted that answer easily, too easily. No one asked why. That was when I realized how thoroughly the role had settled. They didn't just underestimate me, they relied on that underestimation to maintain the balance of the family. If I changed too visibly, it would disrupt the narrative. So my stillness was reassuring. It allowed everyone else to continue without self-examination. I told myself I was choosing peace, that staying quiet was a form of maturity, that families didn't owe you validation, and that strength meant not needing it. Those things were partly true, but they were also a way of avoiding a harder truth, that being unseen had consequences. It eroded something slowly, not confidence. I still trusted myself, but connection. I began to feel like a guest in spaces that were supposed to be mine. Yet even then, I didn't feel victimized. I felt alert, like someone who had stopped swimming against a current and started watching where it led. I began to notice how often people mistook restraint for lack, how silence invited projection, how expectations hardened into ceilings. And once you see that clearly, you have a choice. You can break the pattern loudly and be labeled difficult, or you can let it continue long enough to understand it fully. I chose the second option. At the time, it didn't feel strategic. It felt like survival, like conserving energy in a system that didn't reward spending it. I normalized the disrespect because acknowledging it openly would have required me to want something from people who had already shown me their limits. So I stayed quiet, I stayed useful, I stayed underestimated. And in that space, where no one was watching closely, I began to think differently, not about them, about myself, about time, about leverage. They thought my silence meant I had accepted my place. What they didn't realize was that acceptance can look a lot like patience. Every system assigns roles, whether it admits it or not. Families do it quietly, over time, without meetings or agreements. You wake up one day and realize you've been cast, and that stepping outside that role feels more disruptive to others than staying inside it ever did to you. Mine was clear by my late 20s. I was the reliable one, not the leader, not the visionary, not the concern. I was the one who would handle things. If there was paperwork, I'd figure it out. If someone needed a ride, I'd adjust my schedule. If plans changed at the last minute, I'd adapt without complaint. Reliability, I learned, is a trait people praise right up until they start depending on it without gratitude. When extended family visited, I was the one asked to help in the kitchen. When holidays needed organizing, I was looped in after decisions were already made. If someone needed a form filled out, a deadline tracked, a practical detail remembered, it came to me. My competence was used, not admired, and because I did these things calmly, without asking for recognition, it reinforced the belief that I didn't need any, that I was built for support, not spotlight. The clearest moment came during a conversation about success. My parents were talking about where they saw their children in 10 years. They spoke at length about my brother's potential, my sister's happiness. When it came to me, my father said, "Evelyn will be fine. She's steady. She doesn't need much." He meant it kindly. I know that now. But what he was really saying was that my future didn't require imagination, that whatever happened to me would be acceptable because expectations had already been lowered to a safe minimum. In that moment, something clicked. Not anger, recognition. I saw the shape of the box clearly for the first time. It was a comfortable box for everyone else. It allowed them to feel like good parents without having to engage deeply. It allowed them to invest energy where it felt exciting or necessary. And it allowed them to categorize me as complete, finished, handled. What I realized then was unsettling and oddly freeing. As long as I stayed inside that role, nothing I did would ever change how they saw me. Excellence would be interpreted as diligence. Growth would be interpreted as maintenance. Silence would be interpreted as contentment. The role was self-sealing. I tested it gently. I stopped volunteering for small tasks. Someone else picked them up clumsily. No one noticed my absence. I shared less, and the conversations grew no shallower than they already were. I achieved something meaningful at work and didn't mention it. Nothing changed. That was when I understood the full cost of the role, not just invisibility, but irrelevance to their emotional landscape. And here's the part that surprised me most. Once I saw it clearly, it stopped hurting. Pain requires hope. It requires the belief that if you just try differently, someone will respond differently. When that belief dissolves, what's left is clarity. I stopped trying to be understood. I stopped correcting their assumptions. I stopped offering myself up for interpretation. Instead, I became precise. I did my job well. I managed my finances quietly. I paid attention. I listened more than I spoke. Not because I was shrinking, but because I was gathering information. Patterns, habits, expectations, weak points. They saw none of this. To them, I was exactly who I had always been. Reliable, calm, slightly unambitious. And in a way that was true. I had lost interest in their version of ambition, the kind that needs applause to feel real. What I was building didn't require witnesses. It required time. The role they assigned me gave me something they never intended to offer: freedom from scrutiny. No one monitored my progress. No one questioned my choices. No one imagined I was capable of changing the balance. Being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it's a cover. I stayed inside the role long enough to understand it completely, long enough to stop resenting it, long enough to realize that I didn't need to fight it. I just needed to outgrow it, quietly. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no breaking point, no dramatic realization delivered by pain or loss. It happened on an ordinary weekday, in a place where nothing important was supposed to happen. I was sitting alone in my apartment, late evening, laptop open but untouched. The room was quiet in that particular way it gets after you've lived somewhere long enough to stop noticing the silence. I had just ended a phone call with my mother. It had been brief, polite, efficient. She had called to ask if I could help my sister review some documents. I said yes without hesitation, out of habit. After we hung up, I stayed where I was, staring at the dark screen. And for the first time, I noticed something I had been avoiding. I wasn't tired. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was unchanged. Years had passed. I had grown in measurable ways, skills, income, stability. But internally, I was still responding to my family from the same position I always had: availability without agency, competence without boundaries. That night, instead of distracting myself, I let the thought finish forming. If nothing changes, this is what the next decade will look like. Not worse, just more of the same. More requests that assumed compliance. More conversations that never turned toward me. More quiet contributions that kept the system running while my own life stayed neatly partitioned from theirs. The realization wasn't frightening, it was clarifying. I asked myself a question I had never asked before. Not, why don't they see me? But why am I still showing up this way? The answer was uncomfortable in its simplicity. Because it was easier. Easier to be dependable than to be defined. Easier to fulfill expectations than to challenge them. Easier to remain legible to people who preferred you small than to risk becoming someone they couldn't categorize. That was the moment something shifted, not outwardly, but internally. I saw my silence not as patience, but as participation. I wasn't being held in place. I was helping maintain the structure by playing my part flawlessly. No one had asked me to stop growing, but no one had invited me to either. And I realized that the invitation wasn't coming. So I made a quiet decision, not a vow, not a plan, just a boundary, formed internally. I would stop offering myself automatically, not dramatically, not with announcements, simply, selectively. That meant pausing before saying yes, letting messages sit unanswered a little longer, asking myself whether a request aligned with the life I was building or just the role I'd been assigned. The next time my mother called with a favor, I said, "I can't do this week." No explanation, no apology. She hesitated, then said, "Oh, okay." The world didn't end. Nothing collapsed. No one confronted me. The absence of consequence was almost unsettling. It made me realize how much of my compliance had been unnecessary, how often I had preemptively smoothed things that would have settled on their own. That was the beginning. I started noticing how often I defaulted to invisibility, how often I minimized my own time, how often I framed my needs as inconveniences. And slowly, deliberately, I stopped. Not by demanding recognition, but by redirecting energy. I invested more deeply in my work. I learned things that weren't immediately useful to anyone else. I began tracking my progress privately, without sharing it for validation. I didn't tell my family about these changes. There was no reason to. They weren't part of the decision. What changed most was my posture. Not physically, but psychologically. I stopped waiting for cues. I stopped measuring myself against their reactions. I began acting as if my life belonged to me first, and the family second. That shift was invisible to them, but to me it felt like stepping into a room I had always been standing just outside of. No confrontation, no declarations, just one quiet evening and the decision to stop living as the most convenient version of myself. Once silence stops being imposed on you, it changes character. It becomes deliberate, controlled. Less about endurance, more about direction. After that quiet shift, I didn't suddenly become outspoken. I didn't correct my parents or redefine myself out loud. From the outside, I probably looked exactly the same, calm, agreeable, still slightly distant. That was the advantage. No one adjusts their behavior towards someone they believe they already understand. But internally, everything had recalibrated. I started choosing when to engage instead of responding automatically. If a conversation was performative or circular, I let it pass. If a request came that didn't align with my priorities, I declined without elaboration. Silence, I learned, is most powerful when it isn't defensive, when it doesn't ask to be noticed. My family misread this completely. They assumed I was busy, or tired, or simply unchanged. In their minds, my quietness confirmed their assumptions, that I was still practical, still modest, still orbiting safely within the role they'd assigned me. When I spoke less, they spoke over me more. When I shared fewer details, they filled in the gaps themselves. And because their image of me was static, their interpretations never evolved. That misunderstanding gave me space. At work, I took on responsibilities that weren't visible from the outside, but carried weight internally. I learned the systems no one else wanted to master. I paid attention to how decisions were made, not just what decisions were announced. I asked questions quietly when it mattered. At home, I simplified. Fewer social obligations, fewer explanations, more time alone with my own thoughts. I began to notice how often I had been narrating my life for others, instead of living it. Silence became my filter. I didn't tell my parents about the certifications I was completing. I didn't mention the side projects I was exploring. I didn't update them when my financial situation improved. Not out of secrecy, but out of clarity. Information shared with the wrong audience becomes noise. There was a strange relief in being underestimated. It removed pressure. No one expected a transformation from me, so I was free to pursue it without interference. Occasionally, someone would comment on my quietness. "You're always so reserved," my aunt said once lightly. I smiled. "I've always been this way." It was true, just not in the way they thought. They mistook my restraint for lack of ambition, my calm for compliance, my distance for detachment. And because they believed I was stationary, they never considered that I might be moving, just not where they could see. The most telling moments were the ones where silence was misinterpreted as agreement. When family decisions were discussed that affected me indirectly, assumptions were made on my behalf. "Evelyn won't mind," someone would say. And sometimes they were right. Other times, I noted it carefully. Silence doesn't mean consent, but it does reveal expectations. I began documenting those moments mentally. Not to hold grudges, but to understand dynamics. Who assumed, who deferred, who took space without offering it. This wasn't preparation for confrontation. It was preparation for autonomy. I learned how to move without announcement, how to let others reveal themselves while I remained unreadable, how to build without inviting commentary. And the more intentional my silence became, the less it felt like absence. It felt like ownership. What surprised me was how little resistance there was. When you stop performing your assigned role without making a spectacle of it, people rarely object. They simply adjust their expectations slightly, never enough to question the underlying assumptions. They thought my quietness meant I was still playing small. In reality, I had stopped playing entirely. I wasn't waiting to be seen anymore. I was building something that didn't require recognition to be real. Silence, when chosen, is not emptiness. It's a boundary. There's a kind of work that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with visible struggle or obvious milestones. It happens quietly, in the margins of ordinary life, and from the outside it looks like nothing is happening at all. That's the kind of work I began to do. While my family continued to see me as steady and unchanging, I was studying patterns: financial, organizational, interpersonal. At work, I paid attention to where authority actually lived versus where it was displayed. I learned which processes were essential and which were ceremonial. I noticed how often competence went unrecognized simply because it wasn't loud. I volunteered for tasks that gave me access, not attention: budget reviews, contract coordination, vendor negotiations, the kinds of responsibilities that teach you how systems breathe. I didn't talk about these roles at family gatherings because they wouldn't have sounded impressive anyway. And that was fine. I wasn't collecting admiration, I was collecting understanding. At night, I read, not motivational books, but technical ones: personal finance, business law basics, risk assessment. I learned how to interpret documents that most people signed without reading. I learned what questions to ask before committing to anything. Knowledge, I discovered, compounds fastest when no one is watching. I also started documenting my own life in a way I never had before. Not journaling emotions, but tracking decisions, income changes, skills acquired, time allocation. I wanted to see, clearly and without sentiment, where my energy was going and what it was building. This wasn't driven by resentment, it was driven by self-respect. The more I learned, the more I realized how much power lives in unglamorous places. In preparation, in patience, in being underestimated long enough to operate without interference. My family never noticed the shift because it didn't alter my behavior toward them dramatically. I still showed up, I was still polite, I still asked about their lives. What changed was the internal hierarchy. Their opinions no longer sat at the center of my decisions. I also began to reposition myself socially, not by cutting people off, but by narrowing access. I invested more deeply in a few relationships that were reciprocal and thoughtful. People who asked questions and listened to the answers. People who didn't need me to stay small to feel comfortable. This contrast was instructive. It showed me that the problem had never been my personality. It had been the environment. Meanwhile, my family's perception remained fixed. They assumed my quiet meant stagnation, that my lack of announcements meant a lack of progress, that I was content staying where I was. Occasionally, someone would offer advice I hadn't asked for. "You should think about doing more," my father said once. "You don't want to wake up one day and realize you played it too safe." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because correcting him would have required revealing information he wasn't entitled to. What they never noticed was the accumulation. How one small certification led to another. How one internal project led to a broader role. How my understanding of money shifted from survival to strategy. I learned how to evaluate opportunities not by how impressive they sounded, but by how much leverage they offered later. I learned how to say no to things that paid well but limited growth. I learned how to wait. Patience became my advantage because no one expected anything from me. I wasn't rushed. I didn't need to prove myself. I could take the long view. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my position changed. Not in a way that could be summarized at a dinner table, not in a way that would have impressed my parents if I'd tried to explain it, but in a way that gave me options, real ones. They didn't see the contracts I understood, the assets I managed, the contingencies I planned for. They didn't see how carefully I separated my sense of worth from their recognition. To them, I was still the same Evelyn, practical, quiet, slightly forgettable. That assumption was the last thing they ever truly agreed on about me, because by the time they began to sense something was different, the foundation had already been laid. Quietly, thoroughly, irreversibly. They never noticed the preparation. That was the point. There is a moment that arrives quietly, after long preparation, when you realize you are no longer dependent in the way you once were. It doesn't feel like victory, it feels like orientation, like finally knowing where you stand. For me, that moment came not through an external announcement, but through a private calculation. I was reviewing my finances one evening, something I did regularly by then. Spreadsheets open, documents organized, numbers familiar. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic. I was just checking alignment, income, assets, obligations, timelines. And then I saw it. Not a single figure, but a pattern, a margin, a level of independence I had been building incrementally, without naming it. I realized that I could walk away from certain situations without fear, that I had buffers, options, time. More importantly, I realized I no longer needed my family's approval or even their participation to live the life I wanted. That recognition landed softly, but it settled deep. I didn't celebrate. There was no rush of adrenaline, no urge to call anyone. In fact, the dominant emotion was calm. A steady, grounding calm that came from knowing I could choose differently now. For years, I had operated with an invisible constraint. The need to remain legible to my family. The need to fit within their expectations, even as I quietly outgrew them. That constraint dissolved in that moment. I saw clearly where my leverage was, not over them, but over my own future. Leverage isn't about power over people. It's about reducing your vulnerability. It's about being able to say no without consequence. About making decisions based on values instead of fear. I also saw how asymmetrical the relationship had become. They believed I needed them more than I did. They believed their opinions still carried weight. They believed I would always be available, always agreeable, always positioned beneath their expectations. None of that was true anymore. What struck me most was how unremarkable the moment looked from the outside. I was alone, the room was quiet, no one was watching, and yet it marked the end of an era. I reviewed past interactions with new eyes. Comments that once stung now felt informational. Dismissals that once felt personal now looked structural. They hadn't underestimated me out of malice. They had done it out of habit, and I had allowed that habit to continue because it was easier than disrupting it. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me precise. I understood that any change going forward would need to be intentional, not reactive, not emotional. If I were going to redefine my relationship with my family, it wouldn't be through confrontation. It would be through consistency. I didn't need them to see me differently. I needed to stop organizing my life around whether they ever would. That was the private reveal, not that I had made it, but that I was free to choose what making it meant. From that point on, every decision passed through a new filter. Does this expand my autonomy? Does this align with the life I'm building? Does this require me to shrink to be accepted? If the answer to the last question was yes, I declined. I also became more intentional about timing, about disclosure, about presence. Just because I could reveal everything didn't mean I should. Visibility, I learned, is a tool, not a reward. So I kept my clarity to myself. I continued showing up as expected. I maintained relationships without deepening them unnecessarily. I allowed my family to believe I was exactly who they thought I was. That belief gave me room, because once you see your leverage clearly, you don't rush to use it. You wait until the moment calls for it, if it ever does. I didn't know then that such a moment was coming. I only knew that when it did, I would be standing on solid ground. The reveal was private. The consequences would not be. Clarity forces choice. Once you see what's possible, staying still becomes its own decision, and not always the safest one. After that private realization, I found myself standing at a quiet crossroads. Nothing external had changed, but internally, the options had multiplied. I could continue exactly as I was, stable, independent, underestimated, and there would be no immediate cost. That path was familiar, comfortable, predictable. Or I could shift something fundamental, not loudly, not destructively, but permanently. I considered several possibilities. I could confront my parents, lay everything out, ask for recognition, and explain how their dismissal had shaped me. That option appealed to a part of me that still wanted resolution through understanding. But I knew how that story would end. Explanations don't rewrite narratives people are invested in. They defend them. I could distance myself completely, reduce contact, create physical and emotional space. That option promised relief, but it also felt reactive, like cutting something off instead of redefining it. The third option was quieter and irreversible. I could change the structure of my life in a way that no conversation could undo. Make decisions that shifted the balance of dependency permanently. Build a future where their perception of me became irrelevant. Not because I proved them wrong, but because I removed them from the equation entirely. That was the option I chose. The decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by alignment. I asked myself which path required the least explanation, the least justification, the least emotional labor. The answer was clear. I decided to move forward without announcing it. That meant making choices that would lock in autonomy, long-term commitments, legal clarity, financial independence that didn't rely on anyone's goodwill, decisions that couldn't be reversed by guilt or expectation. It also meant accepting something difficult, that the people who raised me might never fully understand who I became, and that understanding wasn't a prerequisite for peace. I remember the exact moment the decision solidified. I was walking home after work, the city humming around me, people moving with purpose. I realized that my life already felt separate, that I was already living as someone whose center of gravity had shifted inward. All that remained was to formalize it. From that point on, my actions became deliberate. I stopped considering how my choices would be received. I stopped pre-editing my life for family approval. I focused instead on coherence, making sure my decisions made sense to me, even if they made no sense to anyone else. There was a quiet grief in that process, not dramatic, just the acceptance that some relationships plateau, that some people only know how to love the version of you they met first. But there was also relief, because once you choose the irreversible path, you stop negotiating with the past. You stop hoping for retroactive validation. You move forward with clean lines. I didn't tell my parents I was changing course. I didn't warn them that the version of me they relied on was quietly retiring. There was no need. The change wasn't about them. It was about choosing a life that didn't require constant translation. That decision point marked the end of waiting. From there on, everything I did served one purpose: making sure I would never again be in a position where someone else's dismissal could limit my options. The shift was silent, but it was final. Once the decision was made, the work became almost mechanical. Not cold, but focused. I didn't feel the need to rush. Urgency is often a sign that you're still reacting. I wasn't. I was implementing, quietly aligning the external shape of my life with the internal clarity I'd already reached. The first changes were structural. I reorganized my finances in a way that prioritized independence over appearance. Emergency funds became long-term buffers. Commitments were evaluated not by social expectation, but by exit flexibility. I reduced obligations that tied me emotionally to situations I'd outgrown. None of this showed on the surface. To my family, my life looked exactly the same. Same job title, same apartment, same tone in conversations. That was intentional. Transformation doesn't need witnesses when it's built on preparation. I handled paperwork that most people avoid. Legal clarity around assets, updated beneficiaries, clean separation between shared expectations and personal responsibility. These weren't dramatic steps, but they were decisive. Each one closed a door behind me, ensuring I couldn't drift back into old patterns out of convenience. At work, I positioned myself carefully. I didn't chase visibility. I pursued leverage. I took on roles that made me difficult to replace, but easy to underestimate. I learned where information flowed, where decisions stalled, and where influence accumulated quietly. People often assume power announces itself. In reality, it hums, low, steady, unassuming. I learned to recognize that hum. I also began saying no more often, but without explanation, not defensively, not abruptly, just neutrally. I can't take that on. That doesn't work for me right now. I'm unavailable. No excuses, no emotional cushioning. Most people accepted it without protest. That was another revelation. How much of my previous over-availability had been unnecessary? How rarely boundaries are challenged when they're delivered calmly. My family noticed none of this. When we spoke, the conversations followed the same grooves. Updates about my brother's latest plan, concerns about my sister, casual assumptions about my schedule. Evelyn will help, someone would say. And sometimes I didn't. When I declined, there was brief surprise, but no pushback. They adjusted. The system compensated, which confirmed what I had begun to suspect. My role had been convenient, not essential. That knowledge didn't hurt, it freed me. I stopped attending certain gatherings, not dramatically, just gradually. I prioritized my time differently. I invested in things that wouldn't be visible for years. Skills, networks, stability. I also stopped explaining my choices to people who hadn't earned that access. Clarity doesn't require consensus. The silence around my progress deepened, but now it was intentional. I was no longer quiet because I felt unseen. I was quiet because I was moving. What surprised me most was how peaceful this phase felt. There was no internal debate, no longing for approval, just momentum. I wasn't hiding. I was building beyond the range of their expectations. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything was locked in. I had crossed a threshold where my future no longer depended on how anyone perceived me. And once you reach that point, the past loses its grip. They still thought of me as the reliable one, the steady one, the one who would always be there. They didn't realize that reliability, when redirected inward, becomes self-trust. And self-trust changes everything. The first consequences didn't arrive as conflict. They arrived in confusion. It started subtly. A missed expectation here, a delayed response there, small absences that didn't register as intentional, just inconvenient. At first, my family assumed I was busy. Then they assumed I would circle back. Then they began to notice that things felt heavier. When I stopped filling gaps, the gaps became visible. My sister called one evening, frustrated. She was overwhelmed, juggling deadlines, and needed help reviewing documents again. I listened. I empathized. And then I said I couldn't take it on. There was a pause. "But you're good at this," she said, confused rather than upset. "I know," I replied. "I'm just not available." She accepted it, but something in her tone shifted. Not anger, uncertainty. As if a reliable fixture had moved slightly out of place. My parents began mentioning things that hadn't gone smoothly. Logistics that fell through, plans that felt more complicated than before. They didn't connect these inconveniences to me directly, but I could feel the adjustment happening in real time. Systems resist change, even small ones. At a family gathering, my mother commented, almost casually, "You've been harder to reach lately." I smiled. "I've been focused." She nodded, but her eyes lingered. Not accusatory, just recalibrating. What they were experiencing wasn't a loss in the dramatic sense. It was the loss of ease, the loss of assumption, the loss of someone quietly absorbing responsibility without acknowledgement. And because there was no confrontation, no explanation, they couldn't place the discomfort. There was no story to attach it to. They felt it instead. My brother joked once, "We can't rely on Evelyn anymore," laughing as if it were harmless. No one laughed back. I said nothing. Silence doesn't need defense when it's grounded in choice. The more I withdrew my automatic availability, the more the family dynamic shifted. Not enough to spark alarm, but enough to unsettle. They began asking questions framed as concern. "Are you okay? Is everything all right at work? You seem different." Different. The word landed neutrally, but it carried weight. I answered honestly but selectively. Yes, I was fine. Work was going well. Life was steady. Those answers didn't satisfy them. Because they weren't actually seeking information. They were seeking reassurance. That I was still in the same place, still predictable, still accessible. I didn't offer that reassurance. And slowly the realization crept in, not consciously but emotionally, that something had changed without their input. That realization was uncomfortable. They had built an image of me that required consistency. When that consistency faded, even slightly, it created friction. Not because they missed me, but because they missed what I provided. The irony was that they still didn't see me. They saw the absence of a function. And that was the moment I understood how complete the shift had become. I no longer felt the urge to step back in, to smooth things over, to restore balance. The imbalance was necessary, not as punishment, but as truth. They were beginning to experience the cost of underestimating someone who had been quietly holding things together. And because there was no confrontation, no accusation, they couldn't externalize the discomfort. They had to sit with it. That was when the calls changed tone, less directive, more tentative. That was when my presence was noticed. Not because I demanded it, but because it was no longer guaranteed. Consequences don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they arrive as a question no one knows how to ask. And this was only the beginning. Confusion eventually gives way to urgency. Not immediately. People try to adjust first. They compensate. They tell themselves it's temporary. Those things will return to normal once schedules align or stress passes. My family moved through all those stages quietly, without ever naming what was actually happening. They thought this was a phase. I knew it wasn't. The first real sign of panic came disguised as concern. My mother started calling more often, not to ask for help, but to ask about me. The questions were gentle, almost tentative. Are you happy? Is something bothering you? You know you can talk to us. There was something unfamiliar in her voice, not authority, not an assumption, uncertainty. I answered kindly. Honestly, yes, I was happy. No, nothing was wrong. I appreciated the check-in. What I didn't do was reopen the old doors. I didn't fill in emotional gaps that they hadn't noticed before. I didn't explain the years of dismissal or the internal recalibration that followed. Explanation would have implied negotiation. They weren't ready for the truth, not because it was cruel, but because it required them to revise a long-held narrative. And people rarely revise narratives unless they have to. My father took longer to notice the shift. When he did, it came out sideways. "You've changed," he said one afternoon during a rare one-on-one conversation, not accusing, just stating it like an observation. "Yes," I said, "that happens." He nodded as if considering something, then said, "We just don't want you drifting away." There it was, not fear of losing me, but fear of losing access, of losing certainty. I didn't reassure him. "I'm not drifting," I said calmly. "I'm moving." That was the first moment I saw regret flicker. Not fully formed, more like a surprise, as if he had just realized that movement had always been an option for me, and he had never factored that into his expectations. After that, the attempts to fix things became more visible. Invitations framed as nostalgia, suggestions for spending more time together, casual mentions of how close we used to be, even though we never truly were. They were reaching backward, trying to restore a version of me that no longer existed. The problem was they didn't know what they were fixing or why. No apology was offered because no wrongdoing had been acknowledged. No accountability was taken because the discomfort was still felt abstract. They sensed loss, but not cause. And by the time they were ready to ask the right questions, the answers no longer mattered. The structure had changed. I had reorganized my life around autonomy, not inclusion. My decisions no longer hinged on family dynamics. My time no longer bent around unspoken expectations. The space they were trying to reclaim had already been repurposed. This wasn't a punishment. It was a consequence of timing. Regret arrives late because it requires comparison. They could only feel it once they noticed the absence of something they had taken for granted. By then, the cost of reentry was higher than they were prepared to pay. I watched this with a strange mix of empathy and detachment. I could see the confusion, the disorientation, the quiet panic of realizing that control had been assumed, not earned, and I felt no satisfaction in it, only confirmation. Because the truth is, if they had seen me earlier, truly seen me, this moment would never have existed, but they hadn't. And now seeing me meant acknowledging what they had missed. That acknowledgement never came. Instead, there was an unspoken understanding settling in, that something had shifted beyond repair, not in anger, not in estrangement, just finality. They were too late to fix it, not because I wouldn't allow it, but because the version of me that needed fixing no longer existed. And you can't reconcile with someone who has already moved on from the role you assigned them. The confrontation, when it finally happened, wasn't planned. It didn't arrive with raised voices or rehearsed speeches. It happened the way most honest things do, quietly, when there was no longer any point pretending nothing had changed. It was during a family dinner, not a holiday, not a celebration, just a regular evening chosen out of habit more than intention. I almost didn't go, not because I was avoiding them, but because the pull wasn't there anymore. Still, I showed up. Presence, when chosen freely, feels different. The table looked the same. The conversations followed familiar paths. For the first half hour, everything stayed on the surface. Then my father set his fork down and said my name, not sharply, carefully. "You don't really need us anymore, do you?" The room went still, not tense, just alert. My mother looked at him, then at me. My sister stopped scrolling on her phone. I took a moment before answering, not to compose myself, but to decide how honest to be. "No," I said, "I don't." There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just a fact. My mother inhaled, as if preparing to say something comforting, then stopped. "Did we do something wrong?" she asked. That question carried years inside it. I didn't rush to answer. I knew this moment mattered, not because it would fix anything, but because it would define the tone of what remained. "You didn't do one thing," I said. "You did many small things. And more importantly, you didn't notice when I stopped needing to be small." No one interrupted me. That alone was new. "I learned early that being quiet made things easier," I continued. "So I stayed quiet. I stayed useful. And over time, that became the only way you saw me." My father frowned, not defensively, but thoughtfully. "We thought you were fine." "I was," I said. "That doesn't mean I was seen." The words landed without impact or explosion. They didn't need to. This wasn't a trial. There was no verdict coming. My sister spoke then, softly. "Why didn't you say something?" I looked at her. Because every time I tried, it didn't change anything, so I stopped trying. Silence followed, not the uncomfortable kind, just the sound of people recalibrating. My mother reached for my hand, then hesitated. "We didn't know," she said. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. That was the difference. I wasn't asking for acknowledgement anymore. I was offering context. No one apologized outright. No one defended themselves either. It was a strange, neutral space, where understanding flickered briefly, without resolution. And that was enough. "I'm not angry," I said, because it was important they understood that. "I'm just different now, and I'm not willing to go back." My father nodded slowly. "You've built your own life." "Yes, and we're not at the center of it." "No," I said again, "you're not." That was the hardest truth in the room, and the calmest. The conversation didn't continue much after that. We finished dinner. We talked about ordinary things. The evening ended without ceremony. As I left, my mother hugged me a little tighter than usual. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. I believed she meant it, but I also knew it came too late to change anything fundamental. Confrontation doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it just brings alignment, a shared understanding of where things stand. And for the first time, that understanding didn't require me to shrink. Who I am now is not a reaction to who they were. That distinction matters to me. For a long time, my identity existed in contrast. Quieter than my brother, steadier than my sister, easier than anyone else. Even when I began changing internally, part of that change was still defined by what I was stepping away from. It takes time to shed that kind of gravity. Now my life feels centered, not impressive in a way that invites comparison, not loud, just grounded. I wake up without the subtle tension of needing to be available. My time is structured around intention rather than obligation. The work I do aligns with how I think, not how I'm expected to perform. I choose relationships where curiosity moves in both directions, where silence isn't assumed to mean absence, and presence isn't conditional on usefulness. My family is still in my life, but no longer at the center of it. We speak, we meet occasionally. The dynamic is calmer now, oddly more respectful. Not because anything was repaired, but because boundaries are clear. They don't ask as much. I don't offer as much. And in that space, something healthier has formed. I no longer feel the need to prove who I am to them. Their understanding, or lack of it, doesn't define me. When they speak about me now, there's less certainty in their tone, fewer assumptions. They ask more questions. Sometimes they even listen. But that shift isn't what sustains me. What sustains me is the internal quiet that comes from coherence, when your actions, values, and boundaries align without explanation. When your life doesn't require constant narration to feel real. I've learned that being underestimated doesn't mean you're invisible. It means you're free from projection. And that freedom, if used well, can change everything. I'm still quiet, still observant, still reserved in rooms that don't earn my voice. But I'm no longer small. I don't fill gaps that aren't mine. I don't take responsibility to maintain harmony. I don't confuse reliability with self-erasure. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer wait. Not for approval, not for recognition, not for someone to finally notice. I notice. That's enough. The child they dismissed did become something they could no longer deny, but that wasn't the victory. The victory was becoming someone who no longer needed denial or validation to move forward. There's no bitterness in that realization, just perspective. I understand now that my parents loved in the way they knew how. That doesn't make the impact disappear, but it contextualizes it. Understanding doesn't require reconciliation. It requires clarity, and clarity gives you options. My life is not defined by a single dinner or a moment of recognition. It's defined by a long sequence of quiet decisions made without witnesses. Decisions that accumulated into freedom. That's who I am now. Not a reaction, not a role, not a correction. Just a woman who chose herself, without drama, without revenge, and without asking permission. When I look back now, I don't see villains. That's important to say. I see people who acted according to what felt familiar, comfortable, and unquestioned. I see parents who believed that providing stability was enough. I see a family system that rewarded noise and urgency and quietly sidelined anything that didn't demand attention. And I see myself learning slowly what happens when you accept a role without examining its cost. This story isn't a warning about bad parents or cruel families. It's a reminder that neglect doesn't always arrive as harm. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption, as silence, as the quiet decision to stop asking questions about the child who seems fine. The moral, if there is one, isn't about walking into a room and being finally acknowledged. That moment matters, but not for the reasons people think. Recognition doesn't heal what was built on invisibility. It only reflects what has already changed. The real shift happens earlier. It happens when you realize that being underestimated can either trap you or protect you. That silence can be something done to you or something you choose. That you don't need permission to outgrow the version of yourself that kept everyone else comfortable. I didn't win by being seen. I won by no longer organizing my life around whether I ever would be. There is a quiet kind of dominance that doesn't humiliate, doesn't announce itself, and doesn't seek applause. It's built through consistency, restraint, and self-trust. It doesn't ask for space. It takes responsibility for it. And the most surprising part, when you stop trying to prove your worth, people eventually feel the absence of what they took for granted. Not because you punish them, but because you're no longer available to play a role that never fit. By the time they notice, you're already standing somewhere else. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who's always fine, I want you to know this. Your stillness doesn't mean you lack depth. Your silence doesn't mean you lack power. And your patience doesn't mean you owe anyone permanence. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for yourself is to grow without asking for permission and let others catch up or not in their own time. So I'll leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever realized that the moment people finally noticed your worth was also the moment you stopped needing them to? If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. And if you're still in the quiet part, building, observing, preparing, trust that phase. It's not empty. It's formative.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.